People don't always laugh because something is funny. Sometimes they laugh because someone is safe to destroy. I learned that the hard way on a Tuesday night inside one of the most expensive restaurants in downtown Chicago. The kind of place where the lighting is soft, the wine is overpriced, and the people believe their money makes them untouchable. My name is Olivia Bennett. I was 33 years old, a single mother, and a waitress working double shifts just to keep my life from falling apart. That night, I was serving tables like I always did, moving quietly between conversations that were never meant for people like me. The restaurant was full of rich customers celebrating something I did not care to understand. Business deals, stock gains, private victories that always seemed to come with louder voices and colder smiles. I balanced a tray of drinks carefully as I approached table 12. That was when I heard the first comment. "Careful," one of them said loudly, not even trying to lower his voice. "We don't want her dropping anything on us." A few people at the table laughed. I stopped for half a second, then placed the drinks down with steady hands. "Thank you," I said professionally, the way I had been trained. Another voice joined in. "You know, it is impressive how some people manage to stay in jobs like this for years." More laughter followed. I recognized the tone immediately. Not curiosity, not conversation, entertainment. I kept my eyes on the table, not on their faces. That was the rule I had learned early in life. Do your job. Do not react. Do not give them more. But something about that night felt different. Heavier. One of the men leaned back in his chair, studying me like I was part of the decor. "Do you have kids?" he asked suddenly. I paused. "Yes." "Ah," he said, smiling as if he had already won something. "That explains it." The table laughed again. My grip tightened slightly on the tray, but I did not respond. I simply nodded and turned to leave. That was when I noticed him. Table 7. A man sitting alone among a group of executives, dressed in a dark suit that looked too simple to belong in a place like this. He was not laughing. He was not speaking. He was watching. His presence felt different from the others. Not loud. Not demanding. Controlled. His eyes were fixed on me, but not in the way the others looked. There was no amusement there. Only focus. As I passed his table, I felt it again. That quiet attention following me like a shadow I could not shake. I did not know his name then. I only knew that people around him seemed to give him space without being told. The kind of space that does not come from politeness. It comes from fear or respect or something in between. I finished my shift hours later, long after the laughter at table 12 had faded into background noise. My feet hurt. My hands were tired. My thoughts were somewhere else entirely. On my way out, I glanced back into the dining room. Table 12 was still laughing, still untouched by consequence. But table 7 was empty. The man in the dark suit was gone. I did not know it yet, but that night had already been divided into two parts. Before he saw me, and after he decided I was worth remembering. The next morning felt unusually quiet, as if the city itself had not yet decided how to behave after the previous night. I arrived at the restaurant early, before the rush, before the noise, before the customers who treated kindness like a service they had purchased along with their meals. The dining room was empty except for the faint sound of chairs being adjusted and the soft clinking of glasses being set in place. I tied my apron, took a deep breath, and prepared for another day that would look exactly like every other day. But it did not. From the moment I stepped onto the floor, I felt it. Eyes. Not just from customers but from staff. Whispered conversations that stopped when I walked closer. Glances that followed me and then quickly turned away. Something had changed, though no one said what it was. At table 12, the same group of customers from the night before returned. They were louder this time, more relaxed, as if yesterday's humiliation had already been forgotten. One of them snapped his fingers when I approached. "Service here is slower than I remember," he said casually. Another laughed. "Maybe she is still recovering from last night's shift." I said nothing. I simply placed the menus down and stepped back. My training told me to remain polite, invisible, efficient. But inside something had shifted. I was no longer just absorbing their words. I was counting them, measuring them, not reacting but noticing. Across the room I felt it again. That presence from the night before. Table 7. The man in the dark suit was there again. Sitting alone. Observing. This time he was closer to the center of the room. Not hidden. Not blending in. Just present in a way that made everything else feel slightly less important. Our eyes met for only a second. Long enough for me to feel the same strange weight from the night before return. Then he looked away first, as if confirming something only he understood. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of orders and interruptions, but I was aware of him the entire time. Not in a distracting way. In a persistent way. Like a thought you cannot finish. When I finally stepped into the back hallway to take a short break, my coworker Jenna followed me. "You know Table 12 is talking about you, right?" she said quietly. I frowned. "About what?" Jenna hesitated. "About what happened last night. They are saying you made them uncomfortable." I almost laughed. "Uncomfortable?" She nodded awkwardly. "They complained to management." I leaned against the wall, trying to process how humiliation had somehow transformed into complaint. "What did management say?" I asked. Jenna lowered her voice. "They said to be careful. Just avoid conflict." Avoid conflict. The word settled heavily in my chest. As if I had been the source of the problem. As if silence was supposed to fix everything. When I returned to the floor, I noticed something new. The man from Table 7 was no longer sitting alone. He was speaking quietly with one of the restaurant managers near the entrance. The manager looked nervous. Careful. The kind of careful people become when they are trying not to ask questions they are not ready to hear the answers to. I pretended not to notice, but I did. I noticed everything now. Especially the way the manager kept nodding. Especially the way the conversation ended quickly, with a firm handshake that felt more like a conclusion than a greeting. Before leaving that night, I checked the schedule for the next day. My shifts were still there. My responsibilities unchanged. My life still technically the same. But as I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I realized something I could not ignore anymore. I was no longer invisible. And somewhere inside the same city, the man in the dark suit had already started making decisions that I had not been asked to understand. The following day did not begin with noise or chaos. It began with absence. The absence of clarity, the absence of certainty, and most of all, the absence of understanding about what was quietly unfolding around me. I arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual, expecting the same uneasy atmosphere from the day before, but instead I found something different. The staff was calmer. Too calm. Conversations were shorter. Movements more controlled. Even the managers who usually rush through the floor seemed to be observing rather than directing. It felt less like a workplace and more like a space waiting for instructions from somewhere unseen. I tied my apron and stepped onto the floor, immediately noticing that Table 12 had not yet arrived. That alone felt unusual. They had come 2 days in a row without fail, always loud, always entitled, always demanding attention from everyone around them. But today there was no sign of them. Instead, the focus of the room seemed to drift toward Table 7. The man in the dark suit was already there when I arrived. Same position. Same silence. Same controlled stillness that made everything around him feel slightly out of place. But something had changed about him too. He was no longer just watching. He was waiting. I noticed it in the way his attention occasionally shifted toward the entrance of the restaurant, as if expecting something or someone to arrive. I tried to ignore it and began my shift, moving through tables, taking orders, refilling drinks, repeating the cycle I had repeated hundreds of times before. But the sense of being observed had intensified, not just by customers but by the environment itself. Even the kitchen felt quieter. Even the usual frustration from coworkers seemed muted. Around midday, the manager called me into the back office. I wiped my hands on my apron before entering, expecting another complaint or correction. Instead, he handed me a sealed envelope. "This was delivered for you," he said. I frowned. "From who?" He shook his head. "No name." I opened it slowly. Inside was a simple printed document. A formal letter. It did not contain emotion. It did not contain explanation. It contained instruction. My position at the restaurant was being reassessed. My responsibilities were being reviewed. My schedule would be adjusted starting immediately. There was no signature I recognized. Only a reference number and a contact line that led nowhere familiar. I stood there reading it twice, trying to understand how something so formal could feel so personal. When I stepped out of the office, Jenna was waiting for me. She saw the paper in my hand and immediately lowered her voice. "What is that?" she asked. I hesitated. "I do not know yet." But I could feel it. Something had shifted again. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a door slowly closing somewhere I could not see. That evening, the restaurant was unusually busy. Table 12 finally arrived, but their energy was different. Less confident. More restrained. They spoke less, laughed less, and for the first time they did not call attention to me. Instead, they avoided it. As if something about me had become uncertain to them. I noticed the shift immediately, but I did not understand it. Not yet. When I passed table 7, I felt it again. The same presence. The same controlled stillness. But this time, as I placed a drink near his table, he spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to hear. "You are being noticed," he said. I stopped for a second. By who? He looked at me for the first time directly instead of observing from a distance. "By people who do not usually notice anyone," he replied. I did not know how to respond to that. So I did not. I simply nodded and walked away. But the words stayed with me long after I finished my shift. Later that night, as I left the restaurant, I saw something I had not seen before. A black car parked across the street. Engine running. Windows tinted. Still. Watching. And for the first time since this strange pattern began, I realized the truth I had been avoiding. I was no longer part of a normal routine. I was part of something already in motion, something I had not agreed to, something I had not yet been told the full shape of. And somewhere inside that unseen structure, the man in the dark suit had already started moving pieces that were no longer invisible. The next morning arrived with a different kind of silence, one that felt heavier than before. It was not the silence of an empty restaurant or a slow shift beginning. It was the silence of anticipation, as if something had already been decided without my knowledge, and I was simply waiting for it to reach me. When I entered the restaurant, I immediately noticed that the atmosphere had changed again. The staff was no longer just quiet. They were careful. Movements were slower, conversations more deliberate, and even the usual sounds of clattering dishes and distant kitchen commands felt controlled, as if the entire space was operating under unseen instructions. I tied my apron and stepped onto the floor, immediately sensing that table 7 had already arrived. The man in the dark suit was sitting in his usual position, but this time there was someone else with him. A restaurant manager stood nearby, speaking in low tones, visibly uncomfortable. I could not hear the conversation, but I could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands kept adjusting the tablet in front of him without actually using it. When the manager finally stepped away, he passed me without eye contact. That alone was unusual. I began my shift as normal, but nothing about the day felt normal. Orders came in, tables filled, customers spoke, yet everything felt slightly detached, like I was moving through a version of my job that had been subtly edited. Then I noticed table 12. They arrived later than usual, but their behavior had completely changed. No laughter. No remarks. No attention directed toward me. They sat quietly, spoke only to each other, and avoided interaction beyond what was necessary. It was as if the confidence they had carried before had been replaced by caution. I did not understand why, but I felt the shift clearly. Around midday, I was called again into the back office. This time, the manager did not hand me an envelope. He simply asked me to sit. His expression was controlled but uneasy. "There have been changes," he said carefully. I waited. "What kind of changes?" He hesitated. "Your schedule will be reduced starting next week, but your position is not being removed." I frowned slightly. "Why?" He looked down at the tablet in his hands. "It is not my decision." That answer carried more weight than any explanation he could have given. I left the office with more questions than before. When I returned to the floor, I saw him again. Vincent Moretti. Table 7. Same position, same calm posture, but now there was something different in the way he looked at the room. Not curiosity. Not observation. Direction. As I passed by, he spoke again without turning fully toward me. Things are moving faster than expected, he said quietly. I slowed my step. What things? He finally looked at me directly. His expression remained calm, but there was a subtle intensity beneath it now. The things that were already in motion before you became aware of them, he replied. I did not respond immediately. His words felt intentional, carefully chosen, like every sentence had a purpose beyond conversation. Why are you involved in this? I asked finally. A pause followed. Not awkward. Deliberate. Because you were never meant to be treated the way you were, he said. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I could not define it. That is not your decision, I replied quietly. For the first time, a slight shift appeared in his expression. Not surprise. Recognition. No, he said. It is not. The conversation ended there, but the meaning of it did not. When my shift finally ended that night, I stepped outside expecting relief. Instead, I saw the black car again, parked in the same position as before. Engine running, waiting. And this time I understood. Something I had been avoiding since the beginning. Whatever was happening to my life was no longer a coincidence, and Vincent Moretti was no longer just watching it unfold. He was shaping it. The following day began differently, not in appearance but in structure. It felt as if my life had been quietly reorganized without my permission, and I was only now being allowed to notice the new shape of it. When I arrived at the restaurant, the usual noise of preparation was still there, but it no longer carried the same chaotic energy. Everything felt measured, controlled. Even conversations in the kitchen stopped the moment I stepped too close, as if people had been instructed to be careful around me without ever being told why. I tied my apron and stepped onto the floor, immediately noticing that table 7 was already occupied. Vincent Moretti was there as always, but this time he was not alone. A second man stood near him, dressed in formal attire, holding a thin folder. The kind of man who does not belong to dining rooms but to decisions made behind closed doors. I pretended not to look, but I felt the shift immediately. This was no longer observation. This was coordination. I began my shift as usual, moving through tables, repeating familiar routines, but I was no longer able to convince myself that this was just a job. Every movement felt like it was happening inside a larger system I could not see. Even the customers seemed different. Table 12 did not arrive at all. There was no laughter, no mocking, no presence that usually disrupted the air. It was as if they had been removed from the equation entirely. By midday I was called again. Not into the office this time, but toward the back entrance of the restaurant. The manager met me there, visibly tense. Someone is here to see you, he said. I frowned slightly. Who? He did not answer. Instead, he stepped aside. A black car was parked just beyond the service alley, the same one I had seen before. The door opened. A driver stepped out first, then another man in a dark suit. He gestured toward the car without speaking. I hesitated, unsure of what refusal would even mean in a situation like this, but something in the silence told me this was not a request that could be ignored. I got in. The interior of the car was quiet, refined, and completely separated from the outside world. No sound from the street reached inside. No movement felt random. After several minutes of driving, we stopped in front of a building I had never entered before. Tall, private, unmarked in a way that suggested importance rather than secrecy. I was guided inside and taken up in an elevator that moved without noise or interruption. When the doors opened, I found Vincent Moretti standing by a long glass wall overlooking the city. He turned slightly as I entered, acknowledging my presence without surprise. You did not have to bring me here, I said immediately. He studied me for a moment before responding. You would have come eventually, he said calmly. I crossed my arms slightly, trying to steady myself. Why am I here? Vincent stepped away from the window, his movements controlled and deliberate. Because the situation around you has reached a point where remaining outside of it is no longer possible, he said. I frowned. What situation? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed a folder on the table between us. I did not open it right away. Everything you have experienced at the restaurant, he continued. The changes in management, the behavior of customers, the shift in your schedule, none of it is random. My voice lowered slightly. You are saying you caused it. He did not deny it. That silence was answer enough. I looked at him, searching for something that would make this feel less unreal. Why would you do that for someone you do not even know? I asked. Vincent's expression softened only slightly, not into emotion but into clarity. Because I did know you, he said. The words made no sense at first. I shook my head. That is not possible. He stepped closer, stopping at a respectful distance. You do not remember me, he said. But I remember exactly what I saw the first time you were treated as if you did not matter. The room felt smaller suddenly. At the restaurant, I said quietly. He nodded once. And I made a decision that night that I have not reversed. Since. I looked at the folder again, still unopened. What decision? Vincent's gaze held steady. That your life would not continue the way it was before that moment. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of implications I was not ready to understand. Outside the glass wall, the city continued moving as if nothing had changed. But inside that room I understood something irreversible. My life was no longer simply being watched. It was being rewritten. The office was quiet, almost reverent, as if the walls themselves knew the gravity of what was about to unfold. I stepped forward carefully, my hands brushing against the sleek surface of the desk, feeling the cold metal beneath my fingers. Vincent Moretti did not speak immediately, his gaze following mine with a patience that seemed to stretch time itself. Sit, he finally said, indicating a chair opposite him. The sunlight through the tall windows painted the room in sharp lines of light and shadow, highlighting the intensity of his expression. I took the seat cautiously, noticing the subtle tension in the room, the faint hum of the city outside barely penetrating the silence. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk. You have been in motion without knowing why, he began, his voice measured, carrying an authority that required attention. I swallowed, the knot in my stomach tightening as I realized I could not ask the questions I wanted without first listening. Everything that has happened at the restaurant, every small adjustment in your life, has been part of a plan you did not know existed, he continued, and I felt a shiver of understanding pass through me. The folder from yesterday lay between us, unopened, and I could sense its weight even without looking inside. Vincent's eyes locked onto mine, unyielding and precise. I am not here to manipulate or to frighten you, he said, but to offer clarity. Your circumstances are about to shift, and you must understand the reasons before you can act. I nodded slowly, the reality of the situation pressing down with a weight I could not ignore. The decisions I had thought were my own were pieces in a puzzle I had only glimpsed. The people around you, the customers, the staff, all are involved in an environment shaped by intentions you have yet to see, Vincent explained, and I realized that every slight discomfort, every moment of tension had been orchestrated for purposes I could not yet grasp. My pulse quickened as I tried to absorb the implications. He gestured toward the window and I followed, seeing the city sprawled beneath us, unaware of the quiet negotiations happening in this room. Your role has changed, he said, and with it, your understanding of what it means to navigate the world around you. I took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. What must I do? I asked, and his slight nod was the only response, a signal that I was to continue observing, learning, and preparing. For the first time I saw beyond the ordinary, noticing patterns, understanding the silent currents of influence that had always surrounded me. Vincent's presence was both a guide and a challenge, demanding awareness and careful thought. As I left the office later, returning to the restaurant, everything seemed the same on the surface, but beneath the undercurrents had shifted. I moved through the familiar environment with new eyes, noting the subtle ways in which intentions had been laid out, the precise timing of interactions, and the deliberate flow of attention. Every glance, every gesture, every detail was part of a larger tapestry I was only beginning to understand, and I realized that my life, meticulously guided, was entering a phase where observation, patience, and insight would be my tools. The city continued around me, unaware of the silent transformation taking place within its walls, and within the life of someone it had never known fully existed until now. The next morning arrived with a strange sense of order, as if nothing had changed on the surface, yet everything beneath it had been carefully rearranged. I stood behind the counter of the restaurant, tying my apron with slower movements than usual, aware that my perception of this place was no longer the same. Every sound felt deliberate now. Every conversation carried weight. Even the way customers entered and sat down seemed less random than before, as if invisible instructions guided the flow of the room. I noticed Vincent Moretti before I even saw table 7. It was not his presence alone that alerted me, but the way the environment subtly shifted around him. He was already seated, composed as always, but this time there was a quiet tension in his posture, as if he was waiting for something significant rather than simply observing. When our eyes met briefly across the room, I felt the same controlled intensity from before, but now it carried expectation. I began my shift, moving through tables, taking orders, delivering food, yet every step felt like part of something larger I was still learning to recognize. The absence of chaos from table 12 continued. They did not appear, and no one mentioned them. Instead, other customers filled their place, behaving differently than I remembered. Quieter. More restrained. I could not explain it, but I could feel that influence was shifting across the space in subtle waves. Around midday I was called again, but not to the office. This time a staff member quietly asked me to step outside. I removed my apron and followed without argument, passing through the back corridor until I reached the alley. A black car was waiting, identical to the one I had seen before. The door was already open. Inside, Vincent sat alone. I hesitated for only a moment before entering. The interior was silent, insulated from the city completely. Once the door closed, the outside world disappeared. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he studied me with the same calm precision I had come to recognize as his way of understanding situations. "You are adapting faster than expected," he finally said. I looked at him carefully. To what exactly? He did not answer directly. Instead, he placed a small tablet between us. On the screen were names, schedules, and locations. Patterns I did not immediately understand, but which felt important. "Everything around you operates within structures you were never shown," he said. "What you experienced before was only the surface." I felt my pulse tighten slightly. Why am I being shown this? Now. Vincent leaned back slightly, still composed. "Because remaining unaware is no longer an option," he replied. The words were not dramatic, but they carried certainty. Outside the car window, the city moved normally, people walking, cars passing, life continuing without interruption. Yet inside, I felt as if I had stepped outside of that normal rhythm entirely. "What do you expect me to do with this information?" I asked. He paused for a moment, as if considering not just the answer, but the consequence of giving it. "Observe," he said finally. "Learn. And stop assuming that what you see is all that exists." The simplicity of the instruction made it more unsettling. There was no demand for immediate action, no force, only direction. When I left the car and returned to the restaurant, the shift was subtle but undeniable. I no longer saw only tables and customers. I saw patterns of behavior, repeated interactions, silent hierarchies forming in real time. Even the way people spoke to each other carried meaning I had previously ignored. Vincent did not appear again that day, but his influence remained present in everything I noticed. And for the first time, I understood that my role in this world was no longer passive. I was no longer just working inside a restaurant. I was standing inside a system I had never been taught to recognize, guided by a man who spoke less about power and more about awareness, and I was only beginning to understand what that truly meant. The following days did not bring clarity, only escalation. What had once felt like quiet observation had now turned into structured influence, and I could no longer pretend otherwise. Every shift at the restaurant felt different, not because the work had changed, but because the way people behaved inside it had. Customers who once spoke loudly now lowered their voices. Staff who once acted casually now moved with hesitation, as if they were aware that unseen consequences existed for even the smallest mistake. I began to notice patterns I had never seen before. Certain tables arrived at exact times. Certain customers avoided eye contact with me entirely. Even management seemed to operate under instructions that were never openly discussed. Vincent Moretti did not appear every day, but his absence never meant distance. I could feel his influence in the way things unfolded around me, subtle yet undeniable. On the third day after my conversation with him, I was called into the office again. The manager did not look at me when I entered. Instead, he placed a sealed document on the desk and asked me to sit. I obeyed slowly, already sensing that this was not routine. Your role has been officially updated, he said carefully. I opened the document. It contained a revised position description. My responsibilities had not been reduced. They had been reorganized. Shift priority changes, restricted interactions with certain clients, and a new advisory designation attached to my name that I did not understand. Why? I asked. The manager hesitated before answering. It was not our decision. I closed the document slowly. That phrase again. It was becoming familiar. Outside the office, the restaurant continued as normal, but I no longer experienced it that way. I could see the invisible structure behind it now, the way influence moved quietly through decisions, the way certain people shaped outcomes without ever appearing in the conversation. That evening, as I finished my shift, I found Vincent waiting outside again. Not inside the restaurant. Not at a table. Outside. Near the entrance where the city noise mixed with the fading light of evening. He did not approach immediately. He simply observed me as I stepped out. You are beginning to see it, he said when I reached him. I tightened my coat slightly. See what? He turned slightly toward the street. The structure you have always been inside without knowing. I looked at him carefully. You are responsible for everything changing, I said. It was not a question. He did not deny it. Instead, he nodded once. Yes. The simplicity of the answer made it more difficult to process. There was no justification, no avoidance, only confirmation. I took a slow breath. Why involve me in something I did not ask for? Vincent studied me for a moment longer than usual. Because you were already part of it, he said. You just did not know it yet. The words felt like a shift in gravity. I turned my gaze toward the street, trying to understand how my life had reached this point without my awareness. What happens now? I asked quietly. Vincent's expression remained calm, but there was something final in his tone when he answered. Now you stop living as if you are invisible to the world that has already been watching you. I did not respond immediately. The idea was too large, too unfamiliar. But as I stood there beside him, I realized something I had been avoiding since the beginning. The humiliation, the silence, the shifts in my life, none of it had been random. And whatever Vincent Moretti had been building around me was no longer a distant influence. It was becoming my reality step by step, whether I was ready or not. The night felt different before anything even happened. I stood outside the restaurant long after my shift had ended, watching the city move in its usual rhythm, but feeling completely separated from it. The words Vincent had spoken earlier still lingered in my mind, not as sentences, but as implications that refused to settle into anything familiar. You stop living as if you are invisible. That line repeated itself in silence as I walked down the sidewalk, unsure where I was going, only aware that I could no longer return to the version of life I had been living before. When I finally reached my small apartment, everything looked the same. The worn couch, the stack of unpaid bills on the counter, the small shoes near the door that reminded me of my child sleeping in the next room. Yet even this space, which had always felt like the center of my reality, now felt slightly distant, as if it belonged to a version of me that had already begun to fade. My phone buzzed once. Unknown number. I hesitated before answering. Emily Carter, a calm voice said on the other end. It was not a question. I recognized it immediately. Vincent. You are calling again, I said quietly. I told you things were shifting, he replied. I sat down slowly on the edge of the couch. I do not understand what you want from me. There was a brief pause. Not hesitation. Calculation. You already have it, he said. I closed my eyes for a moment, then explained why my entire life is changing without my permission. His voice remained steady. Because permission was never the foundation of what was happening around you. I opened my eyes again. The words were precise, but they did not comfort me. They only made everything feel more structured, more intentional. You are saying my life has been controlled, I said. I am saying it has been observed, he corrected. I stood up and began pacing slowly. Those are not the same thing. In your experience, no, he said. In mine, they often are. The silence that followed felt heavier than the conversation itself. I stopped near the window looking out at the street below. People passed by, unaware of anything beyond their immediate paths. Why me? I asked finally. There was a longer pause this time. When he answered, his tone had changed slightly, not softer but more direct. Because you were the only person in that room who did not react the way everyone expected, he said. I remembered that night again. The laughter. The humiliation. The moment I chose silence instead of collapse. That is not enough to change someone's entire life, I said. It is enough to be noticed, he replied. I did not answer. After a moment he continued. And once someone is noticed in my world, they do not return to being unseen. I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear exactly but awareness. The kind that comes when you realize a path has already been chosen, and you are only now being informed of it. What happens next? I asked. His answer was immediate. You stop being a bystander in your own life. The call ended before I could respond. I stood there for a long time, phone still in my hand, trying to understand how silence had become the most powerful force in my life. Across the city, Vincent Moretti sat alone in a dimly lit room, reviewing information that was no longer just about observation. It was about integration. The woman he had once watched from a distance was no longer outside his attention. She was inside the structure now, whether she understood it or not. And for the first time since this entire process had begun, he allowed himself to consider not just what he had changed, but what she would become once she finally saw the full shape of it.